This is a presentation on how the Electoral College works. A lot of people have a partial idea of this topic, but don't really understand it. At the risk of being hugely nerdy here, I'm going to give you a lot of detail on this, so if you'll bear with me for a few minutes, you will understand quite well how this system works, which is crucial to choosing a president. Now, when you vote for president, what is really happening? Strictly speaking, you're not voting directly for the candidate, even though that candidate's name is on the ballot. Instead, you're voting for a slate of electors pledged to vote for that candidate. Now, electors are typically chosen by each political party. They're extremely loyal to the party. They're party regulars. So almost all of the time they vote for the candidate of their party if that candidate has won their state. Now, a few states, not many, list the names of electors on the ballot, the actual people that you're voting for who will vote for the next president. Most states don't do that. The only name you see on the ballot is for the candidates themselves. Now, today, all states choose their electors by a popular vote, but the Constitution does not require this. For example, South Carolina allowed the state legislature to choose presidential electors, and they only used the popular vote for the first time in 1868, almost a century after the founding of the nation and after the Civil War. So there is no guarantee that individuals can choose a president or have any role in that directly. But right now, all states use a popular vote to choose electors. Now, some basic facts here for starters. Each state gets 2 electoral votes for its 2 senators, and then 1 vote for each of its representatives, its members of the House of Representatives. Now, the House of Representatives is determined by population. But each state gets 2 senators. So, for example, Michigan has 2 senators plus 14 representatives based on its population in the last census, which was 2010, for a total of 16 electoral votes. Now, so you have, if you look on the right here, 50 states times 2 senators, that's 100 electoral votes. That doesn't mean the senators are electors. They're not eligible for that. But these are electors chosen to correspond to the number of senators, which in every case is 2 for each state. Now, the House of Representatives has 435 members. That's determined by law. That number has changed over the course of American history. For a long time, it's been 435. And now, how do you divide up those 435 members? That is by population. The census that's taken this year in 2020 won't be applied until the next presidential election in 2024. So we have now 535, and as a result of a constitutional amendment, the 23rd in 1961, the District of Columbia, meaning Washington, D.C., has 3 electoral votes. It cannot vote in either the House or the Senate, but it does have 3 electoral votes in presidential elections. So if you add those 3, you get 538. That's the total number of electoral votes. And the Constitution says you need a candidate needs a majority of those electoral votes, defined as 50% plus 1, to win the presidency. And that means 270 electoral votes are necessary to be elected president. Okay. Now, please, as you watch this, jot down any questions you have and ask them in class. Now, this time, all of the electoral votes are expected to be gained by the two major candidates. There have been elections in American history where a third-party candidate has gotten electoral votes, sometimes a significant number of them. But the last time that happened was 1968, and it certainly will not happen this year. There's nobody even on the horizon who has any chance whatsoever of getting any electoral votes this year. Now, if no candidate has a majority, either because of a third-party candidate or because of a tie, then it's a whole new matter, and that will be discussed in detail later in this presentation. That's unlikely, but not impossible. You can develop any number of scenarios that would result in an exact tie. Okay. Blue states are Democratic states, red states are Republican states. That's a system that's commonly used in electoral maps. This is the same map is on the wall of our classroom, along with the other historical electoral maps in American history. And you'll see here that most of the state is red, but the election was actually closer than that, because a lot of those blue states are very rich in electoral votes. Most notably California with 55, New York with 29, Illinois with 20. And a lot of these red areas here are from very sparsely populated states, so the total numbers of their electoral votes don't add up to that many. These are maps that you need to be very familiar with. This is a picture of what happened in 2016. The election was determined by 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. They were expected to go Democratic for Hillary Clinton. They did not. And that is why Donald Trump is president. Now, if you look at the popular vote totals, that means the number of people in all the states who voted for one candidate or the other, Clinton actually won by almost 3 million votes. But you'll notice she did not win the election. Now, we're going to be going into that in a bit more detail. Has that ever happened before in American history? Yes. It's happened 5 times in total. In 1824, Andrew Jackson got more popular votes, but John Quincy Adams was chosen by the House of Representatives. In 1876, Rutherford Hayes lost the popular vote, but became president. In 1888, same thing with Benjamin Harrison over Grover Cleveland. And more recently, in the year 2000, in a very, very close election, George W. Bush was elected president, even though Al Gore got several 100,000 more popular votes. And the most dramatic example of that phenomenon was in the most recent election in 2016. Hillary Clinton won that national popular vote by almost 3 million, as I said, but we know that she was not elected president. Okay. Now, this map is from 2008. I wish they would redo one for more recent times, but this will serve to illustrate the principle just as well. A lot of people think mistakenly that the electoral vote is based on population and it's that simple, but it's not that simple. Let's look at 2 states to illustrate this. This is a map that sizes the states according to how much power an individual voter has in those states. Now, Wyoming has the smallest population of all the states, and it has 3 electoral votes. Its population isn't even enough to give it 1 member of the House, but it's guaranteed to get at least 1. So Wyoming has 1 member of the House of Representatives, But like all states, it has 2 senators. So that means you have 3 electoral votes from Wyoming, and that 134,000 people there get to, in effect, be represented with 1 electoral vote. Now let's take California. It has 53 members of the House because of its huge population, and it has the usual 2 senators. But when you add 2 to 53, you don't change the balance very much. But in Wyoming's case, when you add 2 to 1, you triple the clout that Wyoming has. And that is generally true of the smaller states. You look at Vermont, for example, same thing. You look at D.C. or North Dakota, for example. Those are just good examples of states that are overrepresented in the system of the Electoral College. So could this make a difference in a close election? Absolutely it could. Okay. Now, you're going to find as we go through this presentation that things get muddied up a lot. In one way, it's, well, here's one example of that. There are 2 states that don't use a winner-take-all system. The other 48 states, plus D.C., are winner-take-all. So if you win California by 1 vote, then you get all 55 of its electoral votes. Whether you win by 1 vote or 3 million votes, doesn't make any difference. It's winner-take-all. But 2 states have deviated from that, Maine and Nebraska. Now, they're small states. Maine only has 4 electoral votes and Nebraska 5, but they use a system like this. The winner of the statewide popular vote gets the electoral votes associated with the 2 senators. But then each congressional district is a separate election, with the winner of that district getting 1 electoral vote. Now, most of the time, this has not had any practical effect. But in 2008, for the first time in modern times, Nebraska split its vote. It gave 4 of its 5 to John McCain, the Republican, but 1 to Barack Obama, the Democrat, because Obama won the state's 2nd congressional district, which is centered around Omaha and its suburbs in eastern Nebraska. Now, in Maine, something similar happened when Maine gave 3 of its 4 electoral votes to Hillary Clinton because she won the election statewide, but 1 to Donald Trump because 1 of the congressional districts voted for him. Now, notice the states all have the right to make this kind of choice themselves. But if it were adopted in other states, especially large states, it could have a dramatic effect on election results. Let's say that California changed their system to this. And there was a proposal on the California ballot a few years ago to do that. It was defeated. But let's say that they changed this, and let's say at the time that of their 53 members of the House, 13 of those districts gave a majority to the Republican candidate. Let's just say that hypothetically. That means then that the total for California's electoral votes is not 55-0. It would actually be 42 for the Democrats to 13 for the Republicans. There's a big difference between 55-0 and 42-13. In 55-0, the winner, the party of the winning candidate, comes away with a 55 vote advantage. But if it's 42-13, then in that case, the Democrats would only gain 29 electoral votes over the other party. So now, if this happened in California, it would be a disaster for the Democrats, potentially. If it happened in Texas, it could be a disaster for Republicans. So this is, and nothing is going to stop individual states from making that choice. And a lot of voters who are not very educated about what's really going on here could possibly vote something like that in. So this is a wild card. And it's just one of the quirks in our strange system of electing a president. Now, after the election, you'll have an assignment called the Fair Elections Project. I'll give you plenty of details on that later in the course. And it will ask you in groups to choose an area of elections and decide whether it should be reformed. One of those would be the Electoral College. Should we get rid of it? Should we change it? How should we handle it? Now, just to muddy the waters even more, there is such a thing as faithless electors. 99% of electors in our history have voted for the winner of the state's popular vote, but a few of them have not. Now, no election has been decided by these faithless electors yet, but it's kind of a ticking time bomb in a sense. The idea that the founders had was that they couldn't trust the people, so they would have them choose, directly or indirectly, they would choose electors who then would make the decision. But if those electors just go rogue and do whatever they want, is there anything that can be done about that? Well, that depends on each state, strangely enough. In some states, there are criminal penalties for being a faithless elector. The one clear example is New Mexico. It's a felony to vote for someone that your state did not vote for. Other states say, well, we'll fine you like $1,000. Well, $1,000 is chump change given the stakes that are operating in a presidential election. Now, some constitutional scholars believe that these laws that require electors to vote a certain way or punish them if they don't are unconstitutional, and that any elector may vote as he or she wishes. But just this year in 2020, the Supreme Court said that states do have the power to pass and enforce such laws. And this was a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court, which is not always the case with a divided court. So states can pass their own laws on this. Now, what have states done on this? Well, the states in gray have not passed laws restricting the behavior of electors, and that means electors in those states can vote any way they want to. And this includes some very large states like Texas, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and so on. Now, the ones in green have no penalty for an elector who is faithless or who votes against the wishes of the people. And that includes a number of other important states. In blue, there's no penalty, and that includes Michigan, but your vote is canceled and replaced by the vote of your state. So this is a protection against faithless electors. In the yellow states, there's a penalty. In the red states, there's a penalty and your vote is canceled. Now, the purple states follow something called the Uniform Faithful Presidential Electors Act, which is very much like the blue states. The vote is canceled if the elector doesn't toe the line, and it's replaced by what you could call a faithful elector, one who would vote for the wishes of the people in that state. But this underscores the fact that election law is very much a matter of one state versus another. There's not that much uniformity in this. Now, what will happen in 2020 and 2021? The election is November 3rd. Why that day? Because it's the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. If you want to know why they chose that, you can ask me in class. I don't want to take the time to go into that right now. Then, on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December, the Electoral College meets, but they meet in each one of the 50 state capitals. So remember, there's a whole slate of electors that is pledged to vote for Joe Biden, and another slate of electors that is pledged to vote for Donald Trump. That is true in all the 50 states. Now, whichever candidate wins, as certified by state elections officials, the electors chosen by that candidate's campaign will meet in the state capitol. So in Lansing on December 14th, the electors representing the winning candidate will meet and almost certainly cast all of their votes for that candidate. Then, on January 3rd, the new House of Representatives and the new Senate will meet for the first time. And newly elected members will be sworn in. And on January 6th, there will be a joint session of Congress that will meet, House and Senate together, to officially count and certify the electoral vote. So each one of the 50 states will report its vote, and then the joint session of Congress will officially approve that vote, and that is the act that will name the new president. I say new, that will be true whichever candidate wins, because if Trump wins, he will be a new president. In other words, starting a new term. Okay. And then the inauguration of that new president, whichever it is, will be on January 20th. That's established in the Constitution. It will be at noon on the steps of the Capitol. And then the newly elected president and vice president will be sworn in. Okay, I hope you're jotting down any questions you might have here. Now, we're going to dive more deeply into the muck here. What if no candidate receives a majority of the electoral vote? The only way that can happen this year is if it's an exact tie, 269 to 269. Then what happens? Well, this you will find very strange if you're not aware of this. The president is chosen by the House of Representatives. That has happened twice in American history, in 1800 and 1824, but not since then. Now, the House that will choose them is the new House that was elected on November 3rd of this year and took office January 3rd. They will vote. But here's a kicker. The voting will be done by state. And you need a majority of the 50 states necessary to choose a president. This is very different from a majority of the House itself. Because remember, California has 53 representatives and Wyoming has 1. But for this election, the two states, California and Wyoming, have equal power. This was a concession to the small states when the Constitution was framed in 1787. Now, only the top 3 finishers in the electoral vote are eligible to be chosen. I expect there will only be 2 finishers in the electoral vote, and that means that they will have to choose either Biden or Trump. They can't just say, well, let's compromise and pick somebody else. That's not allowed. Okay? Now, in this situation, the vice president is chosen by the Senate. And in that case, only the top 2 finishers in the electoral vote are eligible. Now, the vice president currently is Mike Pence, and if there's a tie vote in the Senate, the vice president breaks a tie. And when this voting happens, he will still be vice president. Even if he loses the election, he will be vice president until January 20th. Okay? Now, if you want to really go out on a limb and get to a bizarre situation, I don't expect this will happen at all, but it's possible that if the Democrats win control of the Senate and control the House, but the Republicans control a majority of the states in the House, we could actually have a President Donald Trump and a Vice President Kamala Harris. And then if the Democrats wanted to reintroduce impeachment proceedings against Trump, this is really wild, but conceivably they could impeach and convict him, remove him from office, which would make Kamala Harris the President of the United States, but not Joe Biden. Okay, so that's, if you want a really off-the-wall scenario, that's it. Now, if that election were to be decided by the House, how would it go? Well, there are no ground rules laid out for this in the Constitution. Republicans now have a majority in 26 of the 50 state House delegations. Democrats have a majority in 22, and 2 of them, Michigan and Pennsylvania, are tied. How those 2 states would resolve the tie is anybody's guess. But if the election were held now, the Republicans would have the power to choose the president in the House. Will that change in the election in November? It could. But even if the Democrats do well, probably the Republicans will still have a majority of states in the House. Because remember, Wyoming and Idaho and Montana have 3 times as much power in this election as California does, because it's voting by state. So if the Electoral College were tied, probably Republicans would win the presidency. But there's more to be said. House members could cast their votes, as I see it, for 5 different reasons. Let's say their approach is, I will vote for the candidate of my party. That's probably the most common one. So let's say Michigan voted for Joe Biden, but the majority of members of Congress from Michigan are Republicans. And the result would be that if they followed their party, Michigan would then cast a vote for Trump. Here's another way to look at it. They could say, I will vote to respect my state's popular vote, even if it disagrees with my own party. So, example, Michigan votes for Biden, but Michigan sends a majority of Republicans to the House. But if some of those Republicans, enough of them, say, I will respect my state's popular vote, then Michigan votes for Biden. Okay, or you could say, I will vote the way my own congressional district voted. That would be reminiscent of the system in Nebraska and Maine. So, for example, if most Michigan districts vote Republican, then the result would likely be that Michigan would vote for Trump. If it's tied, who knows? Or you could say, I will vote as my individual conscience dictates. Now, would some Republicans break with Trump? Who knows? It's uncertain. And you could also say that some members could trade their votes in return for favors. A job after they leave Congress, support for their favorite bill, etc. Does this happen in Congress? All the time. And the result of this is just anybody's guess. So, if you started out to draw up a system like this with a blank sheet of paper, I can't imagine that you would come up with the system we got. But this is what we're working with. Now, why did all this happen? Well, the history of it is very interesting. The founders distrusted the people. So the only body that is required to be democratically chosen in the government is the House of Representatives. It's known as the People's House. Until 1913, state legislatures chose senators. And the thinking behind this is that the founders of the Constitution were mostly elites, highly educated, prosperous, and they were afraid of two things. They had fought a war to oppose tyranny or dictatorship from above in the person of George III, but they also were afraid of what they saw as tyranny from below, mob rule. So although they wanted to give the people a say, they were very nervous about giving them too much of a say. And the Electoral College puts a layer of insulation between the people and the choice of a president. It also was a bit comforting to the small states because they knew that they would have some voice in the selection of a president, and they wouldn't be just overwhelmed by large populated states dominating the popular vote. Okay, so far so good, but there's a whole nasty underside to this whole question. And here it is. The Electoral College helped to protect slavery. Now you might wonder, how could that be the case? Well, if you remember from American history or from government if you've taken it, there's something in the Constitution called the 3/5 Clause. It was a compromise between North and South. The North did not want slaves to count in a state's population because that determined how many seats that state would have in the House of Representatives. But the South wanted slaves to count as full members of the population for this purpose. Well, they compromised, and they decided that the slave population would be counted as 3/5 of the free population. This doesn't mean that an African American is seen as 3/5 of a person. It means that in terms of counting for a representation in Congress, that's how they did it. Now, the problem is this didn't give slaves the right to vote. It just gave representation to slave states based on the numbers of slaves. Now, if the presidency would be determined by an actual popular vote, then the South would have been faced with an unacceptable choice. Either A, they would have to let slaves vote so that the state would have a greater influence in the election, or B, they would have to find another way to count its choice for president. And that's what they did. The number of its congressmen plus senators would determine its electoral votes. But who got to decide those electoral votes? It would be state legislators at first, and then later it would be the white males who actually had the power to vote. Women didn't have the right to vote nationwide until 1920. Now, slave states never would have allowed slaves to vote. But they wanted the numbers of their slaves to increase their state's power. And this is what slavery has to do with the Electoral College. I hope that was a clear explanation. Please ask me if you have any questions about it. Now, did this help the slaveholding states in controlling the presidency? You bet it did. For 49 of its first 61 years, the presidency was held by a current slaveholder. In other words, somebody who owned slaves while he was president. Major figures like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson were included in this statistic. Okay, now what effect or effects does the Electoral College have today? The one I want to focus on is that it means most states are not hotly contested. Everybody knows that California, New York, Vermont, for example, and I could name some others, are safe Democratic states. So the Republicans are not going to pour resources into campaigning in those states because it would be pointless. And on the other side of the ledger, the same is true of Republican states like Wyoming, West Virginia, Mississippi. You know, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are not going to campaign in Wyoming. It just won't happen. And that means that a relatively small number of states is where the presidency will be decided. There are about 13 of them. You could add one or shave one off, but this is about the list. They're known as battleground states or swing states. First and foremost, you have the 3 states that decided the last election: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Michigan, percentage-wise, was the closest to the 50 states. More than 4.8 million Michiganders cast votes in 2016, and the margin of Trump over Clinton was only 10,704 votes. These 3 states were states that she considered to be within her firewall, that even if she lost other states that were close, she at least could count on these. But as we know, that turned out not to be true. Now, there are other battleground states. Let's divide them into who won them in 2016. Trump states included Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, Ohio, Iowa, Georgia, and even Texas that are now considered in play. Polling says that these states could very well go to Joe Biden. If this all happened, it would be a landslide. Now, what about states that voted for Clinton but might be possible as states for Trump? Well, you can only really identify 3 of them: New Hampshire, Minnesota, and Nevada. Maybe Colorado, but that I think is unlikely. So, and this reflects the current polling, which gives a substantial edge to Joe Biden. So this is the situation we're facing. We live in one of those battleground states, but this is what is at stake, and this is how the presidential election will be decided.